Hey, hello and welcome back to
Good
week number
morning.
2 of our video series. Brought my better half with me this morning and thought that would go better. Absolutely. And going to turn it over to her for just a second. She's also the communications director for the class, and let her give a few announcements, and then we'll jump into a lesson this week in the book of Judges. So let me turn it over to the wife.
Hey, you all. We really are missing you and seeing you each week. We hope that you are enjoying viewing the videos and just being able to at least see us. We miss seeing you. That makes me think we are working, a couple of us in the classroom are working on ways that we can maybe be able to video and talk with one another in the next week where we can maybe all see each other. So we'll let you know if we get that worked out in the future. Dave has been working hard every day on the new lesson, which is going to be in the book of Judges. It's going to be really good and interesting. So we look forward to sharing that with you soon.
All right, guys. Well, like I say, we'll go ahead and jump in the book of Judges. Thanks again for joining us again, and hopefully we will be back together in person in the near term. But until then, we're still working on this in this lovely place we've got set up here. It's a big production studio, so you can tell how it's going. Thanks. We'll see you in a second.
Bye.
Okay, so Tanisha just said we're getting ready to start in the book of Judges, and as we do today, I want to kind of bring everybody up to speed. We've got several folks, because of the video format now, that have been able to attend our class that have not had the background for the last 6 months, where we've kind of shared the vision and how we are approaching the scriptures. So I want to just real quickly give them an update, because we do have about a half a dozen new people that are joining us by video, and I'm really thankful, and hopefully they're going to get something from this too, but this will help them at least catch up. Our intent is to look at things from a very pragmatic viewpoint of the 5 W's, and by the 5 W's are the who, where, when, what, and why. And so we look at those each week, and we try to pin down what we can. The who, what, when, and where are being questions of science and can be somewhat pinned down within reasonable understanding. And the why we leave a lot of times, particularly at the beginning of a class, because it's a theological question. And we want that question to kind of be something you're thinking about and praying about throughout the lesson as it goes along. Now, we've got about 4 weeks, I think, in the book of Judges, the way this is laying out. It's roughly 5 chapters a week. Today, we'll only do a couple of chapters, and we'll do a few more at the end to kind of catch up. But that's how I kind of see it going. And I will put up the 5 W's here in just a second with the specifics for the book of Judges. Before that, I do want to mention one quick thing, though. Part of the other side of how we've approached this is we look at this from the words of the Apostle Paul in 1 Thessalonians 5:21, where he says, test everything and keep that which is good. So we try every week to really pressurize, look at everything we can and all the detail that we're able to do within reason, try to make it somewhat streamlined and simple enough to be inclusive in an hour, but then take that information and test that which is good, and do what we can to keep that information as we go forward and build our understanding of the scripture, our understanding of the Lord. And so I hope you'll be blessed by that. That's our effort. Is the entire intent of the whole class is know more about God, understand more about God, and be drawn closer to God. So I hope it's a blessing. Let's go ahead and take a look at the 5 W's. Okay, so our who this morning. In the book of Judges, there are 12 judges that are leaders of Israel that will be raised up. We think the book may have been written by the prophet Samuel, or the prophet Nathan, or the seer Gad, those last two were in the court of David later on, and about all 3 of these guys about 300 years later. Where are we? We're in Canaan, the promised land. When are we? The book of Judges is about the period of 1375 to 1050 BC, and like we mentioned a moment ago, was compiled about 300 years later. And what is the story of Israel's recurring cycle of disobedience during this time? Okay, so we saw the 5 W's, and now we have a rough idea of what we're looking at for the book of Judges. And what we like to also do when we start a brand new book, in this case, this is the first week of the book of Judges, we like to provide introductory notes. And these notes, again, are derived primarily from the NIV Study Bible and from scholar notes in support of that. So none of this is what we think. It's all what we're trying to find from a scholarly intention. And so I'm going to share with you this morning on the screen, and then we'll cover them so that you can see them as well. If you are on our mail list, you should already have this in your hands as a hard copy if you'd like it. If you're not on our mail list and you'd like to become somebody that gets these each week, be glad to put you on our list and be tickled to death to have you as an extra part of our class. So let me go ahead and put that up, and we'll take a look at the introduction of the book of Judges. Okay, on our introductory notes, I wanted you to look at the second one from the top there. And it's talking about who the author was. And we mentioned earlier that it was very likely Samuel or Nathan or Gad. And Samuel was born about 1105 BC, so at the very end of this period. So consider that the writer would be just like you and I. If I gave you the assignment, I said, go write about the 12 first people who signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776, this would be about the same vantage point that Samuel, the writer of the book of Judges, has. So it just kind of seemed like a reasonable way to compare the two. He's not a contemporary. He may have been a contemporary of the very last judge, but by and large, the person who compiled this was not alive during the time period of these folks. We see also in 1 Chronicles chapter 29 where these gentlemen are mentioned specifically as those who chronicled a lot of things for King David, and that's why they think very likely that Judges was written by, or at least compiled by these gentlemen. The other thing I want you to see here that is going to be a recurring theme throughout is in that third bullet down, or the third box down, it says it was a time of recurring cycles, and the cycles are of disobedience, foreign oppression, cries of distress, and of deliverance. And I came from a world of my technology and my company culture was that they had an acronym for everything on planet Earth. So I'm an acronym guy. And I like to look at this today because it's going to come up at least 12 times in the next couple of weeks as we go through each judge. Disobedience, oppression, distress, and deliverance. I'm calling it DODD. That is, they did something they shouldn't have done, and finally God delivered them at the far end. So keep that in mind as we go forward. Okay, so another thing we like to do at the beginning of a particular new section of a book is I like to put a timeline together based on, again, scholar notes, the best available dates that science and the theology community can support. And I like to put it so that you can kind of keep that as a guideline as we're talking throughout the class. So I'm going to bring that up as well in a second, and we'll talk more in detail once you see it on the screen, because it's a whole lot easier for you to be looking at it and listening to me than to be listening to me and then looking at it after the fact. So I'll bring it back up, and I'll be back momentarily. Thanks. Okay, so just a quick glance at this. You're familiar with it from other classes. This week we're looking at the book of Judges, and you'll see on the timeline there in green, it's approximately 325 years, and we've mentioned the dates previously, so I won't cover that again. Just want you to know this is available. We will not go into it in much detail. The only thing I want to mention quickly as we pass through is on the timeline on the below, you'll see all the blue bullet items. The dates in red below those are the dates that are absolutely given as hard a date as they can be found in the NIV study Bible. So they're definitive as far as definitive can be made. The other dates are somewhat ambiguous and we don't know for sure, so I've tried to put those with question marks. And that's the only comment I'll make about this particular slide this week. We'll look at it again in the weeks to come, and if you got any questions, certainly call me in between. Thanks. I'll leave this up for just a second to let you take a final look. Okay, so one other piece of paper. I don't mean to be bombarding you with paper, but I want you to have things to be able to reference after the fact, not just the video. And again, if you don't need them, don't worry about it, but if you want them, they're available to you. The other thing I put together this week, we will use throughout the next 4 weeks, so we'll continue to bring this slide back up, is a list of the judges. And I'll go into specific details here just a second again. I'll bring it up, we'll go into some detail, and then hopefully be back for a few minutes before I give you any more paper this week. Just wanted you to take a quick glance at another resource that you've got available to you. This is the list of the 12 judges, 6 major judges and 6 minor judges, and 1 guy who's called an anti-judge that we will be covering over the next few weeks. It's available, and you can utilize it at your leisure outside of class, and I'll kind of leave it there for the morning. Hey guys, if you were with us last week, you remember we were talking about Joshua, and we ended the book of Joshua. Well, Joshua passed away, and at that time, he had just finished telling them that they needed to go ahead and finish the completion of taking over the land. Heretofore, they had been given and assigned their territory in the land of Canaan, but they had yet to take it. And so it looked like in the middle chapters of Joshua, when he was signing actual specific cities and specific boundaries to everybody, it appeared when you read it the first time around that in fact that had taken place. What we're going to find out this morning as we start the book of Judges is that the actuality of that was it actually did not take place until after Joshua's death. And we'll see that very clearly as we start this morning. I think we'll do just a couple of chapters and a little bit of chapter 3, and then we'll break down how we'll complete the class for over the weeks to come. But let's start this morning. And again, I think I'm going to go back straight to the Bible, which is a whole lot easier to for a couple of chapters to do it this way. And so I hope you'll enjoy what we're getting ready to cover. In Joshua chapter 1, in verse 1, it says, after the death of Joshua. Thus, the discussion I just had that all this stuff is taking place after the death of Joshua. Now, if you recall back in Joshua chapter 15, the previous book, that Joshua gave Judah, the tribe of Judah, the land, the first thing. They were the ones they rolled the dice, the Urim and the Thummim, and they were the first one to get a lot. He also told them at that time that some of the guys came to him and said, hey, what about Caleb, one of our brothers? He's supposed to get the land of Hebron or get the city of Hebron. And Joshua assigned that to him as well. And if you recall from that story, Caleb takes Hebron, and then he wants to take another city close by called Debir. And in order to do that, he says, whoever will rise up and take this city, I will let my daughter, I think her name was Aska, marry this person. Well, it turns out that person is his nephew. And so they were first cousins. Again, back in the Old Testament, that was not that unusual. But a guy named Othniel, and we'll find him at the very end of today's lesson. He's also the first judge, turns out later. Now, the reason I mention this as we start the very first verses of Judges, I want you to pay attention here in just a few minutes. That exact same story that was in Joshua 15 is now taking place in real time in Judges 1. So the story that was told in Joshua had to be written in the book of Joshua after Joshua died, because it says here in Judges 1, after Joshua's death, and we're going to see the story, this took place. And it's the exact same story that we saw in Joshua 15. So the writer we mentioned earlier that possibly was Samuel, possibly was Nathan, possibly was Gad, that same person very likely is trying to take these stories, and they're overlapping a little bit. There's not a very clear cut, it ended here and the next thing started after that. There's actually some overlap. So that helps us to get some context as we start this morning. So it says, after the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, who will be the first to go up and fight for us against the Canaanites? Well, the answer is the Judahites, just like he said back in Joshua chapter 15. It says, Judah is the first to go. I have given the land into their hands. So Judah, and they talked to their brothers in Simeon, and Judah and Simeon decide to go together to take this land. And if you look on a big map, and I'm not going to bring up any more maps this morning, but if you look on the maps we've had in the past, Judah and Simeon's actually inside of Judah. So they were partners in more than just this adventure. They were partners together in a lot of things. It says they went up to a town called Bezek, I think. Yep. And they killed the king there, a guy named Adonai-Bezek. Now this guy Adonai-Bezek was a bad Canaanite guy, and the Canaanites were not good anyway, but this guy was rough. He had subdued 70 kings around him and cut off their thumbs, I think, and their fingers, their big toes. Their thumbs and their big toes. So that was a way of showing his dominance by taking over the 70 cities around him. Well, the Judahites and the Simeonites take and fight him, and they end up winning. It says then Adonai-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off have picked up scraps under my table. Now God has paid me back for what I did to them. So they brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. And there they also cut off his thumb and his big toe to show him who was the boss now. So Judah took over, and Judah took their part of the land. Now the very next thing comes up is the story that I just referenced about Caleb and his nephew slash son-in-law, Othniel. It says, after that the men of Judah went down to fight the Canaanites living in the hill country, the Negev and the western foothills. They advanced against the Canaanites living in Hebron, formerly called Kiriath Arba, and defeated there Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai. Now, Hebron was the city that Caleb was given to take, and we're going to see in the next sentence or two that's exactly what we're talking about. I want to stop here for a second and remind you, the three guys it says they defeated there in Hebron, the guy's name was Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai in verse 10. They are the Anakites, and if you recall from several months ago, we were kidding around, but I tried to make the point that these were the giants that originally the people were afraid of when they were afraid to come into Canaan back 40 years prior. These giants, and I always like a good basketball reference, were about the size of Shaquille O'Neal. So we were fighting, the Judahites today were fighting a bunch of Shaquille O'Neals, three of them in particular that held the city of Hebron. So he goes on in verse 11, and he says, from there they advanced against the people living in Debir, formerly called Kiriath Sephar, and Caleb said, I will give my daughter Aska in marriage to the man who attacks and captures Kiriath Sephar. Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it, so Caleb gave his daughter Aska to him in marriage. This is the exact same story that was told in Joshua 15. Again, this takes place in real time after Joshua's death, and thus we're pretty certain that the person who edited Joshua and edited Judges, and very likely be the same person, they went back and put this story back in Joshua. It's not wrong, it's not out of order, it's just that you don't really anticipate it being there, so that's why I'm trying to dwell on it for just a second for you to see. So this timeline is not exactly Joshua ended and this started. There's some overlap. Okay. Now, once they did that, Othniel took the city and got we end the exact same story, the exact same way. The daughter asks for some land, daddy gives it to her, and Othniel and she go off to their thing. And we will see him come back in a few minutes in chapter 3, like said, in the role of a judge. But in the interim, not only Judah, but the rest of these tribes were trying to take their land. So Judah and Simeon as a group were the first ones, but then they went on and some other people started trying to take their particular territories as well, as they should have. And it says, for example, said, as Moses had promised, Hebron was given to Caleb, who then drove from it the three sons of Anak, the three Shaquille O'Neals. The next one up says, the Benjamites, however, failed to dislodge the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. To this day, the Jebusites live there with the Benjamites. So Judah and Simeon took their territory, took Hebron, took Debir, got the son-in-law involved. The Benjamites at the same time were fighting for some territory. Jerusalem is on the boundary of Benjamin and Judah. When Judah took all this land, they beat up Jerusalem, it says, and took it, but they obviously then left the land, and Benjamin came along to take it into their cities and to assimilate it, because it's actually just barely in the edge of Benjamin. And the Jebusites remained there from that point forward. Now we're going to see, and that's the theme I want you to see throughout the rest of chapter 1. We've been trying all along. The original story of Joshua was one of the Israelites having conquest to get into the land. They got the 31 cities and a foothold. Now this story in Judges is about the completion of that conquest and actually conquering and taking over the land. And we're going to see what happens to that end. So the Benjamites left some Jebusites. Then we go on in verse 27, said, but Manasseh did not drive out the people of Bethshan or Tanakh or Dor or Ibleam or Megiddo and their surrounding settlements. So the Manassites are taking their territory at the same time, or roughly concurrently. They also leave people in the land. So they leave the Canaanites. It says, for the Canaanites were determined to live in that land. So Manasseh took their territory, but left Canaanites. Benjamin took their territory a moment ago, left Jebusites. So the next thing it says, nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites living in Gezer, but the Canaanites continued to live there among them. So now we've got Benjamin left some folks, Manasseh left some folks, and Ephraim has left some folks. And the theme continues. It says, neither did Zebulun drive out the Canaanites living in Kitron, nor did Asher drive out those living in Acco. And I'm just skimming down here. I'm not reading every single city for you, but you're going to get the idea. It said, neither did Naphtali drive out those living in Beth Shemesh, but the Naphtalites too lived among the Canaanite inhabitants of the land. And then lastly, it says the Amorites confined the Danites, so the tribe of Dan was trying to take their territory, and the Amorites, it said, confined them to the hill country, not allowing them to come down into the plain. So what we've got here this morning is an example of, once they did finally go after Joshua's death to start trying to take and completely crush the Canaanite in their territory and take it from them, they had a very mixed bag of results. And in fact, most of the results were they took a little and left a whole lot. So there's still a tremendous amount of Canaanites and Amorites, the very people that we've said all along were had prostitution in their temples. They sacrificed their children. They had other gods. And so we're going to see that theme continue. Now, going from there, from the story of occupying the land, the next story that comes up in the beginning of chapter 2 is this, and it dovetails perfectly with what the writer of Judges is trying to say. He tells a story of the angel of the Lord appearing to the Israelites at a place called Bochim. Now, how did the angel of the Lord appear to them? It does not say. At this point, we know that the high priest is Phinehas, and very likely, in my opinion only, he appears to the high priest in some way and sends this message. And he sends it at a place that is just outside of Gilgal. Now, at this point, Gilgal, which is where they started when they first came into the land, remember they came across the River Jordan and they camped at a place called Gilgal. Here we are years later, and the multitude of the camp, the majority rather, is still sitting at Gilgal as of today. And so the 31 cities, I'm sure, have occupying people. I'm sure there's other folks that are occupying or trying to do other things, but the main camp of the Israelites remained at Gilgal. And just outside of Gilgal, at a place that Phinehas was likely visited by this angel of the Lord, they named it Bochim. And they named it Bochim because the word Bochim means to weep, and you're going to know why they named it that here momentarily. He gives them news that they don't want to hear. So let me look at chapter 2, and it says, the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land that I swore to give you to your forefathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land, but you shall break down their altars. Yet you have disobeyed me. That's a strong one. Why have you done this? Now therefore I tell you that I will not drive them out before you. They will be thorns in your side, and their gods will be a snare to you. So once we finally got in chapter 1, after Joshua dies and a period of time passes, and all these tribes went and started to take the land, almost every single one of them left Canaanites there. And now the angel of the Lord is appearing at the end of that first push, if you will, and saying very clearly, you've done a bad thing. I've been very clear from the beginning. Moses was clear. Joshua was clear. This is your call. This is what you're supposed to do, and yet you've chosen to do otherwise. So what's the result of that? disobedience and defeat is what's getting ready to take place. And as we look at that, it's just like we said a few minutes ago, the acronym DODD, disobedience, oppression, distress, and then deliverance. We're getting ready to see that pattern begin in earnest in the book of Judges. So in verse number 6 of chapter 2, it says, after Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land, each to his own inheritance. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all these great things the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua then dies, and it goes on in verse 10, it said, after that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. And I'm skipping a few verses ahead to verse number 12. Said, they provoked the Lord to anger because they forsook him and served the Baal and the Ashtoreths. I think that's Ashtoreths. That's verse 13. Let me stop for just a second and clarify something with that as well. Baal was a god of the Canaanites. The word Baal in Canaanite meant Lord. So they were saying Lord just like you and I would say Lord Jesus or Lord God. The Canaanites had the god of Baal. They also had a goddess, female counterpart to Baal called Ashtoreth. And she was, in their culture, considered the wife of Baal. Now, Baal and a lot of their art and a lot of their sculpture and a lot of their temples generally appeared standing on the back of a bull as I guess a sign of power and a sign of virility. And so you'll see a lot of that. If you pull up Baal, you'll see that as the pictures you'll get a lot of times. Interestingly, Baal was not just a Canaanite god, but also in other areas thereabouts. So Aram and Moab and some other places that were not believers in the Lord God, they also worshipped Baal or some version thereof, and they also worshipped Ashtoreth in some version thereof. And I'm going to pull my list down here in a second because I can't remember them all from the top of my head, but I want to read a few of these names because you've heard them before, and when you hear them, you'll be a little shocked to put these together. So let me do that real quick. From the Baals, let's see, it says, if the Phoenicians were worshiping Baal, they called him Dagon, D-A-G-O-N. So we'll hear that come up a little bit in the future in some of our studies. Also, they called him the son of El. In Aram, which if you recall from our map is usually the top north above Israel, in Aram they called him Hadad, And in Babylonia, which is Mesopotamia, Iraq, they called him Adad. So Baal could be either called Baal, Dagon, son of El, or Hadad, or Adad. So he had 5 names depending on what territory that he was in or what territory the people were worshiping him in. Now Ashtoreth, and this is the one that kind of caught my eye and I really wanted to bring this out, was she's the wife of Baal, but in Aram she was known as Ishtar or Athtar. And again, that was the country north of Israel. In Greece, now this is one where it starts to get interesting for me. In Greece, Ashtoreth is also called Aphrodite. And we'll see in the New Testament, some temples to Aphrodite and some other things. And you and I have heard Aphrodite, I'm sure, in general culture, wherever it may be. In Rome someday, Ashtoreth is also known as Venus. And you definitely have heard of Venus. I hear commercials on TV singing with the word Venus in it from time to time. So we have to be thoughtful and careful that what we think is an innocuous thing and Venus is just some ambiguous god. It was actually the female counterpart of the Baals and Ashtoreths that God said was absolutely awful and have no part of. I think that was the last one I had for her. So, okay. So that was the end of discussion of the Baals. Now back to our earlier discussion about disobedience and defeat. As we mentioned, the pattern of DODD said, then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. So God heard their cries, the distress, and he raised up judges to deliver them. It said, unlike their fathers, they quickly turned from the way in which their fathers had walked, the way of obedience to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord had compassion on them as they groaned under those who had oppressed and afflicted them. So again, the pattern of DODD, disobedience, oppression, distress, and deliverance. It says, but when that judge had died, the people returned to their ways even more corrupt than those of their fathers, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. And we know how that story's going to end up. God has mercifully reached down time and time again and tried to bring them back, and under the premise of the person who asked for that help, he's given them peace and he's given them what they should have had, prosperity and safety. And then each time somebody that passes away forgets about God and they go right back to that same disobedience and willful, it says, and even worse each generation. It says, therefore, in verse 20, chapter 2, it says, therefore the Lord was angry with Israel and said, because this nation has violated the covenant that I laid down for their forefathers and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. Said the Lord had allowed these nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua. God had allowed them back before Joshua died, like I said, to remain in the land because what he was going to do was use them as a test. Now, they didn't realize that, I don't think, at the time. I didn't realize it going into this study. God left those people, the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, all the Hivites, in the land at the time that Joshua had first conquered those 31 cities because he wanted to test the people. Are you going to stay obedient to me? Are you going to stay in covenant with me, the covenant you've signed on to and agreed to multiple generations of you, your fathers and your grandfathers from Moses now to this time have signed on Moses' death in the plains of Moab. They signed a covenant. When they were in Shechem last week, they signed a covenant. And yet, for whatever reason, they continue to be disobedient. And God has left these people. They could, if the Israelites had been innocent and done the right things, doing what God said and obeyed him, God would have cleared completely the land. When they didn't, these people are going to be used as a punishment to make sure that Israel understands the oppression, to lead to distress, to lead them to begging for deliverance and coming back to God. So that's the end of chapter 2. I will mention just quickly in chapter 3, some of the people that we'll see significantly throughout the remainder of this are going to be the Philistines on your map, which we don't have and don't want to, again, to bring up another map. Bottom left on the coast, there's 5 cities that we talked about a couple of weeks ago that are going to be the Philistine cities. These people are going to be a thorn in the side for hundreds of years until the time of David, which is about 300 plus years away. So they're left for this purpose, and it lists them here in chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. So to kind of finalize today, we've talked a lot about the book of Judges, about where we were. This has been the prologue, the introduction to the book of Judges, and that there was 12 judges. I want to go ahead and at least give you the taste of one of those this morning. So we'll finish today's lesson with the very first judge, who was Othniel. And like I mentioned earlier in the class, he was Caleb's nephew, his brother's son, and he also was Caleb's son-in-law because he married his first cousin, Caleb's daughter, Aska. And it goes on in just a couple of verses here to kind of tie it up at the end. In chapter 3, verse 7, it says, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of, and there's a king here, and I'll just see it on the list. I'm going to call him CR because it's a big name and it's a lot of syllables. So they sold him into the hands of CR, king of Aram, to whom the Israelites were subject for the next 8 years. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. And the Lord gave this king Seir into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. And so the land had peace for 40 years, until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. So the pattern will repeat. You'll hear it next week through a variety of different places, through a variety of the next 300 years. You know, we're still in the 1350-ish to somewhere in that range. And but it will go over the next 300 years, over the next 3 weeks. And this pattern, unfortunately, continues to repeat itself. The people quickly forget God. I'm not sure how that can be, but they do that. And they quickly forget and they quickly pay the price. And so, again, to bring us to an end for the week, I want you to kind of think about your week. And again, I do this a lot in class. For those that have seen me in class, I'll do it for the video. I'm talking to me, not to you. If it applies to you, then apply it. But I'm talking to me. This week in particular, I want to take away the pattern for my life of disobedience and oppression and distress and deliverance. I want to just kind of live in the deliverance and forget about the rest. So I'm going to give up DODD this week and replace it with just GOD. How about that? So I hope you'll do the same, that you keep focused on the Word. And while we're all in the house for the next couple of weeks, no better time than ever that you have a little bit of opportunity to study. Be looking ahead for chapters 3 through 8. I think it's next week. It's about 4 or 5 of the Judges. I don't recall which ones, but they're the next ones in the list. You'll see them. Just keep reading ahead. Their stories are unique. Their stories are valuable because they teach lessons, but their main story is very much the same as this one, disobedience and eventual deliverance. Again, I hope you guys have had a good 2 weeks. I know we've been in the house praying for you, continue to check on you, continue to check on each other. I can't encourage that enough. Check on some other folks at church. You know, we got a lot of folks in the other classes that could just use a call from anybody within the church would tickle them to death, and I'm sure that they would appreciate it. If you need anything at all, we're here. We're working on production, and hopefully these videos are improving. I apologize for what you're getting so far, but we're just trying to get something that we can all look at together and share a little bit of time. As Tanisa mentioned, finally, we're trying to do some sort of interactive social thing online where you maybe can see each other and have some visiting time. She'll be back with you in the next weeks, hopefully, and give you something. And my hope is we're back at church prior to needing that. But if not, we got a plan in motion, and there won't be another week goes by that we don't see somebody's face on a video somewhere other than mine, thank goodness. All right, you guys have a wonderful week. Thank you very much for staying with us, and hopefully more good stuff to come. God bless you.